Mia stormed into the office that morning with a cup of coffee in hand, her mind running over the plans she had set in motion for the company. As CEO, Mia had always been confident, organized, and unwavering. She had built this empire from the ground up, and no one, especially not a new, cocky consultant, was going to disrupt the order she had established. And yet, there he was. Victor, tall, with an air of mystery that surrounded him like a shroud. His dark hair was neatly combed, and his sharp suit clung to his physique in a way that made Mia's pulse quicken, though she'd never admit it. From the moment he walked into her office a few weeks ago, Mia had sensed the danger he posed, not in terms of business, but to her carefully constructed walls. He was smart, confident, and to top it all off, charming in a way that made her blood run hot. She had to stay focused. There was no room for distractions, especially not from someone so utterly captivating. "Mia," Victor greeted, his voice smooth, with a hint of something that made her look up, her fingers freezing on her keyboard. "You're here early today." His words weren't a question, but they made her hesitate. He was always so sure of himself, never faltering, never uncertain. Mia forced herself to smile, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Business waits for no one, Victor," she replied briskly, avoiding his gaze as she walked past him toward her desk. She needed to focus, to shut him out. The moment their eyes locked, it was as if an invisible current ran between them, something electric, undeniable. But she refused to acknowledge it. Over the following days, Mia found it increasingly difficult to ignore Victor's presence. He wasn't just any consultant, he had an uncanny way of understanding the company's operations. But more than that, he seemed to understand her. Every suggestion he made felt calculated, perfectly timed, as if he knew exactly what to say to get under her skin. There were moments when their eyes would meet across the conference table, and for a fraction of a second, she would see something there, something dangerous. His gaze was intense, assessing, and she could almost feel the weight of it on her skin. It wasn't just the meetings. It was the small moments too. The accidental brush of his hand against hers as they passed each other in the hall. The way he leaned in just a little too close when speaking to her, his cologne filling the air. Mia tried to resist it, to push the attraction away, but it wasn't easy. Victor was a constant pull, and the more she tried to ignore it, the more it consumed her. She hated how he made her feel vulnerable, exposed. It was as if he could see straight through her, to a part of her she never showed anyone. But she couldn't afford to lose control. Not over Victor. Not over anything. One late evening, as Mia worked through yet another pile of paperwork, she glanced up to see Victor standing in the doorway of her office, his posture relaxed, but his eyes filled with something deeper. "Still here?" he asked, a slight smirk tugging at his lips. "You're working too hard. I thought you might need a break." Mia narrowed her eyes at him. "I don't take breaks," she replied, her voice cold but her pulse betraying her. His presence was unsettling, but in a way she couldn't entirely define. Victor stepped further into the office, the faint click of his shoes against the floor echoing in the quiet room. He closed the door behind him, his gaze never leaving hers. "You don't have to do everything alone, you know," he said softly, his voice low, almost intimate. "You don't have to carry the weight of the world on your shoulders." Mia felt a strange tightening in her chest. She opened her mouth to reply, but no words came out. She was aware of the way his gaze lingered on her, his expression unreadable. "I'm not alone," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't need anyone." But Victor only smiled. It wasn't an arrogant smile, but one that spoke of something more, something that made her question her own words. She couldn't afford to let him in. Not when she had worked so hard to keep herself above everything, to remain untouchable. She didn't need anyone. She certainly didn't need him. The days following that night in her office felt different. Mia tried to ignore Victor, but it was impossible. His presence, always there in the corner of her mind, felt like an unspoken challenge. The way he looked at her, the way he knew her, despite her best efforts to keep her walls intact, he had found a crack. Mia's mind raced as she sat in her office the following afternoon. She had a mountain of work to get through, but every time she tried to focus, her thoughts kept drifting to Victor. What was it about him? What was he doing to her? Then, as if summoned by her thoughts, Victor appeared in the doorway again, his eyes dark and intense, his posture confident as always. But today, there was something else in the way he looked at her, something that made Mia's heart race. "Busy again?" he asked, his voice smooth and casual. Mia straightened in her chair, trying to act unaffected. She lifted her chin slightly, giving him a professional smile. "I've always got work to do, Victor. That's what keeps the company running." Victor crossed the room slowly, his movements purposeful. There was no mistaking it now. He was coming closer, and he wasn't planning to leave until something changed. "I think it's time we stopped pretending," he said, stopping just a few feet away from her desk. His voice was low, almost as if he were speaking only to her. "You've been running from this. From me. From what we both know is real." Mia's breath hitched, and she stood abruptly from her desk, her heart pounding in her chest. The way he was looking at her now, with that intensity that made her feel like she was the only person in the room, it was too much. She had to get away from it. But Victor was already closer, his body nearly touching hers. His presence was overwhelming, a force that couldn't be ignored. Mia tried to back away, but he moved with her, closing the distance between them with an ease that sent a rush of heat to her cheeks. "Stop," she whispered, but her voice lacked the strength she intended. She felt his hands brush against her arm, a touch so gentle it made her skin burn. He was so close now, so dangerously close. "You've been pretending, Mia," he repeated softly, his fingers trailing down her arm, making her shiver. "But I can see through it. I can see the way you look at me. I know what you want." Her heart was racing, and her mind screamed at her to stop, to push him away, to remind herself of her power, of her position. But his touch was a silent invitation to something more. Something she had never allowed herself to feel. Not like this. Not with someone like him. Mia started, but she couldn't finish. His eyes held hers, and for the first time, she felt something shift inside of her. Something she had buried so deep she hadn't even realized it was there until now. "Mia," Victor said, his voice soft but insistent, "you can't keep pretending you don't want this. Don't you feel it? This pull between us." She swallowed hard, her chest tight. "I'm not," she began, but the words died in her throat as his hand cupped her cheek, tilting her head up toward him. His touch was electric, and for a brief moment, Mia closed her eyes, letting herself feel the heat of it. "Stop fighting it," he murmured, his lips brushing against her ear. "Let go, Mia. Let me show you what it feels like to truly surrender. To feel everything." The moment he said those words, something inside her snapped. She had been running from this, running from him, running from herself. But no more. She was tired. Tired of pretending, tired of resisting what was clearly inevitable. Mia could feel the weight of his presence, the way he filled every inch of the room, and for the first time in a long time, she let herself lean into it. She allowed herself to feel the power of his touch, the undeniable pull that had always been there, lurking beneath the surface. Without thinking, without planning, she closed the distance between them and kissed him. It was a kiss of desperation, of need, a kiss that shattered the walls she had so carefully constructed around herself. Victor responded immediately, pulling her closer, his hands finding their way to her back, pushing her into him with a hunger that matched her own. Their kisses deepened, and Mia found herself losing control, her body responding to him in ways she hadn't expected. The power, the vulnerability, it all merged together in a perfect storm of raw emotion. Victor's hands moved to the buttons of her blouse, undoing them with a skillful precision that only intensified the fire inside her. "Are you sure?" Victor whispered against her lips, his voice low and filled with desire. Mia's breath was shallow, her heart racing. She had no words. All she could do was nod, her hands fumbling with the tie of his suit, pulling him closer as if she couldn't get enough. She needed him, needed this. And Victor didn't hesitate. He swept her off her feet, carrying her toward the couch, his lips never leaving hers. Their movements were frantic, as though they had been waiting for this moment, for the release that came with giving in. The hours that followed were a blur, a mix of passion, vulnerability, and surrender. But as the morning light filtered through the blinds, Mia found herself lying next to Victor, his arm draped protectively around her. The reality of the situation slowly began to sink in, and she couldn't ignore the rush of conflicting emotions. For so long, she had lived in control. Now, she was lying next to the one person who had managed to break through all her defenses. The one person who had made her realize that true power didn't come from control. It came from trust. Mia turned to look at Victor, his features softened in sleep. She had fought him for so long, convinced she could never give in. But now, she realized something. There was strength in surrender. And maybe, just maybe, Victor was the one person she had been waiting for all along. As he stirred, opening his eyes and looking at her with that same intense gaze, Mia finally allowed herself to smile. "We can't go back, can we?" she asked softly, her voice thick with emotion. Victor's lips curled into a smile, and he gently cupped her face. "No. But together, we can move forward." And for the first time in a long while, Mia felt whole.